Isn't it time you got to know your technology leaders? You're listening to Off the Record with GTRA, and I'm your host, Kelly Oakham. So grab your coffee or cocktail and join us for our casual yet intimate and thought-provoking expose on our top council members, ambassadors, technology innovators, and thought leaders. Thank you for tuning in to today's Off the Record with GTRA. I'm very excited to introduce today's guest, Steve Schmalz, the Federal Chief Technology Officer with RSA. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Great. Well, I'd really like to start by getting to know a bit more about your impressive career. How did you get started in all of this? I mean, why cryptography?
Well, after Columbus University, I went to SMU, Southern Methodist University, and I got a degree, a master's in applied mathematics, which was perfect. Some of the mathematical techniques I was learning were perfect for finding oil, which in 1986 was something that nobody was really interested in doing anymore. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember that
Wow.
particular downturn in the oil industry. So I got lots of practice interviewing with oil companies, but no job offers. And I was very lucky to get an interview with NSA, where my math background was sufficient to get an offer from the government.
How interesting. What an interesting journey. I bet it was enlightening to learn what you did about the oil industry and then what a transition to just jump right into government.
Yes, deja vu all over again, I guess.
That's right.
I joined NSA in 1986, and I spent probably the first half of my career there learning new and interesting mathematical techniques, using those to solve problems, and then writing really bad code. But fortunately, we had a lot of good computer scientists there who could help me correct some of my programming problems. But it's interesting because I really got exposure to what I would call the core or the foundation of modern security. I mean, that's what cryptography really is, and it's hard to think of sort of any field of security that doesn't have some form of cryptography underneath. It's not always encryption. It could be some form of access management or of authentication, but crypto is usually there somewhere. But as I continued my career with the agency, I was able to get exposure to some of the bigger questions, which is more around how and why would you use certain cryptographic techniques to protect certain data, and how would you protect it? And then the longer I worked there, the more I realized that everything couldn't be solved with a clever algorithm, and that you had to harness that wealth of data and sophisticated techniques that cryptography brings along to help people solve problems, and that security was sort of a combination of very powerful techniques, but then people trying to employ them to protect their assets.
Mm-hmm. Well, and obviously not divulging anything that you couldn't talk about confidentially. But how did you see that evolve from over the 13 years you worked there, from going from probably what was very archaic technology to current technology?
Well, while I was at the agency, I was actually there through the release of the first internet browser. So when I first started working there, I was working on dedicated computers. I was working on mainframes, and when I left, there was close to what you have today. There were PCs that you could connect to the internet via browsers. So I saw the growth of security, at least the initial growth, from basically protecting radio communications, and to then trying to protect financial transactions as they bounced around the world.
Yep, it was a fascinating time watching things go from a filing cabinet to a computer, and then afterthought, oh, how do we secure all this very critical information? But I'd love to learn more about your work on the Accredited Standards Committee.
Yes, well, when I first joined RSA, after leaving the government, I sort of focused on our encryption portfolio, and I got involved with X9 in an effort to make sure that the practical implementations that we were seeing for cryptography, specifically tokenization, was being reflected adequately in the standards that were being developed. X9 is a wonderful organization, and over the years, working with various committees, I finally ended up as the editor for the tokenization standard there, which hopefully we will finish in the next couple of months. We should be finishing that about the time that I then move on to my next phase of my career, which won't be involving as much cryptography, but much more on the identity and access management space and on this question of governance that I think is so important these days.
Now, what exactly does X9 do? I've personally never heard of it. It sounds interesting.
So they're a standards group that develops standards to protect the U.S. banking and financial industry. Mm-hmm. And I got to be careful. I probably should have had something written down because I'm sure that Steve Stevens, who is head of the organization, is probably going to be checking to make sure I described what they do adequately.
No worries, no worries. So you really had a long career with RSA, 16 years. You must be really key to their solutions, and it must be a great company to work for. I mean, this is pretty rare. So what would you attribute your lengthy tenure to?
You know, I would say it's the impressive growth of RSA from what was a great company that initially, so those in the audience may not know, but Security Dynamics was the original company, the name of the company that developed and implemented the Secure ID token. They then acquired RSA Data Security and then adopted the name RSA. And from there, the company went on to grow from a company that did sort of two things, either strong two-factor authentication or cryptography. They went on to develop, they went on to play in the world of access management, to security information management by aggregating logs and doing analysis of logs, to doing anti-phishing, to providing anti-phishing products, to acquiring a full packet capture company, which has grown now to provide one of the major components in our security offering. So I think the amount of time I've spent with RSA is a function of how interesting it's been to be here as the company has grown from focusing in a couple of small product areas to really the major focus of the industry today when it comes to defending cyberspace, which is being able to detect cyber attacks, being able to manage those with a good governance, risk, and compliance posture, and then to be able to firm up access to that critical information with a good identity and access management portfolio. So I try not to repeat myself, but I've been here so long because it's been a fascinating company that's continued to grow, so I've been able to grow with it.
Yeah, a lot of exciting growth at EMC, acquiring or merging. How did that affect RSA, and how has that been a positive thing on the solutions offering?
Well, EMC's acquisition of RSA was fantastic in the sense that as a larger organization, they were able to sort of bring us under their umbrella and allow us to grow and focus on those three major components that I just mentioned. As to how we continue to grow as in the future, that we'll have to wait and see.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it's going to be interesting, and we're all looking forward to it.
Definitely. Well, and one other organization that RSA and EMC acquired, NetWitness, that has been an interesting transition, I'm sure. How has the technology evolved since that acquisition?
Well, it's really changed our focus and provided us focus. Again, the core portfolio of products around full packet capture, combined with aggregation of security logs, combined with pulling information off of the endpoint, and then making available the right analytics technology to use that information to identify advanced persistent threats. That is the core of our offering now. The governance the governance infrastructure I talked about from another acquisition of Archer, which is fantastic, just layers over this core security analytics capability, the ability to do overall governance in the organization. So NetWitness has become, I'd say, one of the three pillars of our organization.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's definitely something that our GTRA government community has always been a fan of, and working with Amit Yaran, your CEO. So, coming from the being a federal CTO for the organization, I'd love to talk about the government cybersecurity efforts in light of President Obama's recent executive activity. So, in terms of governance, is not just management. It's about getting various constituencies to work together toward a common security goal. Why is this critical?
Well, in fact, I've on my computer screen right now, I have the Federal Cybersecurity Research and Development Strategic Plan, and core to this, this is security governance and the biggest possible picture. This is the administration deciding that we needed to focus in this space and that we needed to bring various constituencies together and get them all to agree what needs to be done. There's the carrot and the stick aspect. There's funding, as well as specific requirements spelled out. So you're absolutely right when you mentioned security governance being the process of pulling various constituencies together, not only getting them all on board in a particular direction, but getting their input as to what that direction should be. And the Cybersecurity National Action Plan is, in the biggest stage possible on the national stage, a governance exercise to do just that. And I mean, we're talking about multiple constituencies. Obviously, we're talking about the average individual who needs to sign on to the internet and just wants to be able to easily get on and do what they want to do, to large companies who want to make sure that their financial safety is protected, to the government organizations who have critical pieces of information or have critical infrastructure, like the national power grid that needs to be protected. You have so many different constituencies with so many different needs that this is something that had to be done. Somebody had to try to pull all these constituencies together and get us aimed in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are certainly a lot of new products in the security market with touting the term governance, so to speak, in their name. What do they need to actually accomplish to be a success?
Well, they need to do more than just use the term governance in their title as a synonym for management, and do more than just allow somebody to put together pretty reports. You said it initially. Governance is about bringing constituencies together. So any product that touts itself as a governance product has to have tools which allow people to communicate, allow people to exchange ideas, allow you to build workflows which gets each part of the organization involved in the way they're supposed to be involved, and then allows you to go back and to audit the activity and to determine whether or not the plans you have put together are working or not, and to take that information, feed it right back into the system. So governance needs all of those pieces to work right. It needs to have the constituencies committed, and it needs to have them involved, and it needs to have workflow which keeps them involved and keeps measuring the success of the plan that they've come together on.
Mm-hmm. Well, and, the identity and access management space is in dire need of good governance. What can be done to fill this critical gap?
You're absolutely correct. And in fact, you're seeing that in the industry today. Not only RSA, but other companies are offering what would be called identity and access management, which has been morphing into identity governance. And in the case of access management, in the case of governance around access management, I think that the key component there is making sure that the managers, the inline managers, those whose employees have to get access to resources, those managers know what their employees need, and they have to be involved in the access management decision. In the past, that wasn't the case. It was the case in the least possible work that you could imagine for the managers themselves. They would send an email out to the IT group, and the IT group would just send some broad access privileges up to their employees. That needs to change, and that's part of the governance piece in the sense that those who know who should have access to what need to be very closely involved in the decisions about giving that access. Now, that's more than just the managers of the people. Those are the owners of the applications and of the resources that are being accessed. And it's also the security organization that needs to be concerned about any exposure of any sensitive information. All of those constituencies need to play together. And the way that you get that to work in the access management world is that you first try to bring all the information about who has access to what into a central repository. Now, it may not be possible to bring everything into one repository, but right now there may be dozens or hundreds of repositories in some large organizations. It's impossible to know who has access to what because the information is spread out all over the place. So initially you bring it together. Once you brought it together, you can then implement good workflows about assigning access, reviewing access, auditing access, and then you can bring together strong workflows when it comes to removing access when people leave the company or change jobs.
Mm-hmm. What do you think some of the recent security governance failures were from?
Well, it's usually from individuals having far more access than they should have. I mean, the most famous incident with Snowden, it just involved with him being able to see more than he should have been able to see. And in fact, I can't give specifics, but I've been in meetings where people were looking at potential solutions which could prevent another incident like Snowden from taking place. And the most refreshing comment or the most refreshing reaction I ever saw was that, we're in there with a lot of other companies touting our solution as being the way to prevent something like this from happening again. And that individual throwing his hands up and saying, look, we had what we needed to prevent this. We had the controls in place. This was a problem of us just not implementing those controls. Well, that's a question of governance. That's getting a buy-in from that organization and the management of that organization to agree who should have access to what, to enforce it and to audit it. And you're not going to get that buy-in unless you lay it out on the table at the start and unless you provide both carrot and the stick, regulations and then motivation to do the right thing.
You're right. It's critical that leadership implements and then also enforces it. And there needs to be, personally, I don't think there's any repercussions for the employees. The entire burden is on the organization or the government or the healthcare company, and that employee who's, misusing or accidentally, mistreating sensitive information, gets off with nothing, and the burden falls on the organization. So unfortunately, I do think it is a leadership, need that we need more of in government. Now, two-factor authentication doesn't solve every problem and can be counterproductive on a single form or two-factor authentication. Let's talk more about this.
Well, that's an interesting issue. I think one of the problems here is the fact that when access was first being granted to those first computer programs, the first time people were given access to a mainframe, the idea of providing them an authentication mechanism, a username and a password, that was access control. They had a username and a password to access a particular computer to do a particular set of things on it. I mean, the functionality was limited. The number of things that you could do, the computer resources just were not as great as they are today. So what's happened is, over the years, as as the number of things that you can do online has just exploded, and especially now, even on your mobile devices, that it's become impossible to literally assign a particular username and password or strong two-factor authentication for every single resource that you want to get access to. Mm-hmm. So obviously, the industry's had to develop this concept of role-based access control. And, recently there's been the terms attribute-based access control, and it's even gone farther than that. But the move to sort of role-based to try to get some reduced or single sign-on functionality has been one of necessity, just to keep the users from going crazy, from having to have, 15 types of two-factor authentication. The joke is, in our company, is they have a key ring with 50 fobs on it. You just can't have that. So you've got to have a way of using the same form of authentication to access multiple things. Well, now authentication and access control have to be separated. So just the process of authenticating is not enough to say somebody should have access to something. Well, a lot of the initiatives that you see, which are legitimate, which are initiatives around strong two-factor authentication, I think are giving short shrift to access control because it's still sort of a knee-jerk reaction to think that good authentication sort of translates into good access control, and it doesn't. Not only that, but if you shouldn't try to sort of standardize on a single form of access control, no matter how good it sounds, then you're going to be put in a situation where you can't use that form of authentication to access certain resources. A perfect example of that would be the use of a CAC or a PIV, which might be great for waving in front of the door in the morning and putting your PIN in and getting in the door. It might even be good to sit down at your PC where you've got a smart card reader and you can slot it in and get access to certain internet resources. But it's not so good when you're trying to access something from your cell phone. It's a lot more cumbersome. And there simply might be some legacy applications that just cannot implement the protocols necessary to securely use the smart card-based authentication to get access to something. So something like Secure ID is much more suited to that, in the sense that the interface for, not to tout the RSA product, but the interface for a Secure ID token is literally that you're typing the numbers that you see on the Secure ID token into the screen or onto a device. Which means that the requirement for a particular reader or a particular protocol isn't as great. So various forms of two-factor authentication are better suited for particular situations. And sort of saying that we have to have a single form of authentication across the board is going to be it's just a recipe for guaranteeing that at some point that two-factor authentication will not be used to protect a sensitive resource. Mm-hmm.
Well, and, what would you say then, do you think, are some of the biggest threats facing the federal government, and, really what should be their priority for 2016?
Well, looking at the cybersecurity framework, looking at the Cyber National Action Plan, these are all fantastic documents, and I think we're going in the right direction. I'm just a little concerned, again, that there is too much focus on authentication without enough focus on access control on the back end. You can do a lot with access control to mitigate failures with authentication. If you limit access to things, then the fact that you may have a failure on the authentication side means that you just have less stuff exposed. I'm not saying you don't need strong authentication. I'm not saying two-factor isn't great. I'm saying that I think we need more focus on the access side itself, and that we need, now, by the way, that exists. And in fact, I don't want to criticize one part of the federal government without mentioning that there's other parts of the federal government that are absolutely, and other parts of our standards bodies, national standards bodies, that are addressing this. Mm-hmm. The National Cyber Center of Excellence has put together a couple of use cases where they've implemented what I would consider good access control processes, which include governance. One example is the energy sector, where you have sort of one set of access control to get physical access to buildings and parts of the utility infrastructure. You have the operations side where you get sort of online access to other parts of the energy infrastructure, and then of course you have the IT part of the organization where you get access to various other resources. Those three sort of siloed those siloed processes each one of them had a separate workflow, had separate people, and if you wanted to see who had access to a certain building and then what IT resources they had access to at the same time and what operational resources they had access to, you'd have to go to three different places, and you may not even know where you're supposed to go to find that out. So the National Cyber Center of Excellence did a great job in putting together a use case where they demonstrated how you could bring all those access privileges together in one place, and you can manage them all. You could bring an employee on board. You could give them access privileges to all three of those previously siloed processes. You could manage the removal of that access. You could provide a way to move people from one geographical region to another where some of their access privileges would follow. It is really a great piece of work. So,
and where can listeners find that use case? That sounds like a great resource.
Right. So if you Google NCCOE, in fact, what I will do is I'll take a quick look here.
Well, and I just wanted to mention on the call, it'd be great, and we'll include a link as well, actually, on the site, so people can easily access that. But yeah, really good point. I think honestly, one of the other things that could just be summed up from what you were saying, though, is that you can have these extremely valuable resources, but if they're not implemented and the leadership isn't there, then it's not going to be valuable. It's not going to be utilized and exposed to us.
That's absolutely correct. In fact, I've got it here. It's there is a new set of publications, special publications that NIST is putting out, the 1800 series. That's 1800. So this is NIST Special Publication 1800-2, and it's Identity Access Management for electric utilities.
Well, let's shift gears slightly now. I want to talk about what can you tell us about RSA's Advanced Security Operations Center and what it's for?
So our ASOC offering is all around how to pull together the different pieces of information that you need in order to identify, potential advanced persistent threats, issues in the organization, cybersecurity threats. And having all the pieces is nice, and in fact, RSA has a great portfolio of those individual pieces. I mentioned our security analytics product, which is one of the leaders in the industry for full packet capture. It also is able to ingest logs. It takes and it indexes that information so that you can very quickly find information, correlate information. But there are more pieces of information that you really need in order to build a good security operations center. You would like to have information about what's happening on the endpoints. RSA happens to offer a fantastic product called ECAT, which allows you to identify malware on endpoints, even if there are not digital signatures, even if they're not, not digital, but even if they're not signatures for malware. Your audience probably knows that in the past, the way that you would identify malware is that you'd hash a certain part of that code, and then as you saw snippets of what could be potentially malware, you'd check to see if that hash checked or not, and if it did, you say, this code is bad. I don't want to allow it to run. Well, modern malware can change itself, and those signatures just don't work anymore. Our ECAP product is able to sit at an endpoint, watch for irregular behavior, watch for things that just don't look normal, and identify malware before you've actually been able to determine those signatures. So it's the endpoint. It's about bringing information from the endpoint about potential malware that or botnets that might be running on those endpoints. There's even information that you might glean from previous attacks, from previous exploitations. You might have a list of bad IP addresses. You might have information that's just been released about potential new attacks. All that has to be brought together, collated, and made useful to the analyst. And that's what our Advanced Security Operations Center is all about, bringing that information together and using it effectively and appropriately to identify threats.
Excellent.
And by the way, we don't even leave out access management because certainly if you've been keeping track of who has access to what, and you found out that somebody's had access they're not supposed to have, or as you're investigating some breach, you want to know, who had access to this resource. I haven't identified who got there yet, but who in our organization has access. You want to reach into the data repository that supports your access management governance program. Bring that into the picture as well, and use that to help determine what's going on.
Well, it's great to see that you're actually doing something on the operations side. I mean, so what are some of the core competencies that set RSA apart from your competition? If I'm a government or healthcare agency and I'm deciding on my investment, who am I comparing you to, and why am I choosing RSA solution?
Well, I think it's the fact that our solutions work together. I mean, I just described, an Advanced Security Operations Center and the ability to bring all these pieces of information together to identify potential threats. RSA is one of the only companies I know that not only has the underlying pieces, but sort of orchestrates them all together, provides a way to use all of those pieces together to protect your organization, to provide cybersecurity. If you take a look at the cybersecurity framework and you look at the requirements, RSA's three core offerings that I've described previously map to almost to the majority of those. Obviously not to everything, but it maps to the core requirements. So RSA solutions sort of give you the framework to build a comprehensive cybersecurity solution, as opposed to an important piece. Now, there's no problem with companies that specialize in some very particular area and provide great technology and do a great job in that area. And in fact, RSA was one of those companies at the start. We were the best in the world at strong two-factor authentication. But we've grown into a company that provides a framework which encompasses encompasses the core functionality you need to provide cybersecurity. And I think that's what differentiates us.
Without giving a specific agency by name, can you give us somewhat of a case study of how you detected a threat, respond to the incident, change the organization moving forward, somewhat of an in-the-trenches perspective?
We had a breach where important information about our secure ID tokens, the seeds of the secure ID tokens, were compromised. And so here we're not talking about a government organization. I really would have trouble talking about it. In fact, I don't even think I'd be allowed to talk about a government organization.
Understood.
But our own experience, in fact, what the RSA that exists today was born of that breach. And what for other companies might have been an issue and might have actually destroyed them, made us into a far better company. We were using some of the same technologies which are now key to our current portfolio. We were using those to help us identify the breach, to identify how the seeds were compromised, and it involved full packet capture. It involved analysis of various pieces of information, bringing it all together. It involved all the stuff I've discussed before that you want to have an Advanced Security Operations Center. It involved bringing all that together to help solve what was an attack from a major nation state. So we're not talking about the fact that we accidentally left some small. there was some small door open and somebody, that anybody could have come through. The attack that was launched against us is the kind of sophisticated attack that is being launched against organizations across the country and across the world right now. And our ability to respond to that and our ability to use the tools which we now offer to our customers, I think is probably one of the best case studies that you could look at.
Absolutely. What exciting new Z innovations does RSA have in the pipeline?
So this is right before the RSA conference, and I'd prefer for everybody listening to tune in and listen to the announcements there.
Sounds like we have something exciting to come. All right. Well, this has been truly a pleasure, getting to know you personally and, sharing all of this great information with our listeners. So we appreciate it. Steve, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you again for tuning in. Please join us for our next council meeting and upcoming podcasts. Go to gtra.org. Again, I'm your host, Kelly Yoakum, and I look forward to your topic ideas, feedback, and suggested podcast participants. So please feel free to reach out to me at kelly@gtra.org.